So what I'd like to do today, I'd like to basically call attention to some certain classes of effort and to present that simple model very useful for communicating reasons why we behave in those seemingly strange ways, ways to communicate the health of our teams, the state of our teams, and what kind of control points we have in order to actually get to better outcomes over time. And it's really more generally just to provoke and encourage a lot of introspection about the kind of work that we do. Backing up, again, what do we actually know about software development? I highly recommend this one talk. It's probably one of my favorite software development talks of all time by Greg Wilson. Basically, he spends an hour and 10 minutes or so talking about how we have very little science behind this multi-trillion-dollar industry. We basically don't understand ourselves, but we have this sense that there's a lot of value, and we see a lot of value, so money keeps on coming into it. But we're still much more craft than science. We can't make very strong claims about our efforts, and that can get us into the weeds. So where do we start, if not with the scientific literature? Well, there's experience. Just looking at the scientific method, maybe we've had enough conversations, we've been around enough, we've learned the wisdom of the elders to the point that we can develop a little bit of basic theory around these common observations and patterns in our observations. Maybe we can even go so far as to generate a few hypotheses. Even if we don't invest in actual experiments, which tend to be very expensive in this space, just because software engineers are paid a lot, theory can also serve as the basis for systematized communication to actually help other people who might not be as familiar with software development understand our work, and also it tends to help more than I even expected, and I think more than a lot of people think, just talking to each other. So starting with a typical breakdown of types of effort that we might be spending. We spend a lot of time in feature development. That's usually what we talk about because that's where the value comes from. We talk about infrastructure development. We spend time like typing stuff in and doing deploys and like other manual stuff, and we talk about this mysterious thing called technical debt that we all have some sense that we should be paying attention to. So just going into what all these things are. So feature development. So basically, when we're doing feature development, we're directly creating value. Cool. We're constructing new functionality. It's enhancing, it's improving things. This is the stuff that you sell. Then there's infrastructure development. Infrastructure development tends to not create value. It indirectly supplies value by enabling the faster and the cheaper value creation by its users. So this is really an investment. We'll get to why that might be confusing in a bit and try to dispel that. But the idea is that you can achieve some nonlinear growth in the efficiency and the value of the features you're developing through targeted investment. Then there's time and operations. There's really a whole sub-industry around this, but operations are a thing that we do that tends to preserve value. We keep the lights on so they don't stay off when they crash, and we also need to do those deploys, or else all that stuff that we just wrote really doesn't do much for us. And so operations just is that kind of constant time that you spend that takes away from spending time doing things that actually create value directly, like feature development. Then there's technical debt. So technical debt gets confusing, and I'll talk just a little bit more about that. But basically, the idea here is that as technical debt accrues, it just drains the value right out of your efforts. If you have technical debt that just runs rampant and you're not addressing it, then basically your velocity in feature development, the degree to which you're creating value with your software development approaches zero over time. You just flatline, and that sucks. Using these really basic kind of dimensions, let's start reasoning about some of the predictions. So if we increase the time that we spend on feature development, we get more value creation. That's great. And we also get more operational requirements. All the stuff that we put in production has to be operated in some way. So that's an interesting little trade-off right at the beginning. Then with increased infrastructure development, well, you're spending time doing infrastructure development rather than doing feature development, which means that that time that you're spending on infrastructure development is not being directly used to create value into the system. So we all hope that if you're doing that, you're spending your time really wisely. The payoff is that there's maybe less time operating things if you're doing a DevOps project, and potentially there's more value that you get the next time you do feature development or when one of your client teams does feature development. Then there's increased operational spend. That just means less time in feature development and doing other things. Depending on the type of work that you're doing in operations, it might also cause a lot of stress. Then increased technical debt just sucks the value out. So all these things, very, very straightforward. So what are we actually trying to optimize for here? So I figured I had to have an equation that's very simple. But what we're trying to do organizationally is just maximize the value creation within the timeline. So that means basically, it's the time that you spend in feature development times the efficiency of the feature development. And so you have a few controls over how to twiddle the value of the time that you're spending in feature development. Just the overall time that you spend. If you're only spending 20% or 10% of your time in feature development, maybe that's not enough. Maybe it is. Depends on the project. Oh, go ahead.
Is that actually indicative of the mix of activities your team is doing?
It depends on the team. I actually did an exercise where I aggregated everything across all of Oscar, which is a lot of teams, and it was actually a little bit scarier because the amount of time that was spent overall on tech debt was around 11 or 12%, and that kind of explains some things. And there's probably too much time spent in feature development and not enough time like really maintaining the value of that spend. But all the teams varied. Some of the teams vary wildly. And it's interesting and can be very, very surprising. We've had teams that started to see each other a little bit for the first time after having some of these conversations. Anyway, very fascinating. I'll get a little bit more into that. So you can make targeted infrastructure investments in order to speed up your value creation. You can make targeted tech debt investments, targeted being the key word on both of these things. And you can also design for increased operational efficiency. There's a few things you can do there, but there's not that much theory over in that space. But that's some good practice. And the idea here is really just to make sure that everybody is laser focused on being able to communicate their efforts in terms of the value creating exercise. As otherwise, I mean, I don't know how many of you have had the experience of feeling like you maybe got in the weeds, or like somebody over there was getting in the weeds with an infrastructure project. Doing that thing, it seems cool, but I don't know what the hell to do with it, and I'm not sure if that's gonna work. And it's just that's just. Sorry, I'm going to be a VP for just a second, and just say that's like salary spend just going straight into a black hole. It's a little scary. And then getting back to a more humanistic stance, that's all just time that got wasted that could have been added into, in my particular case, creating better experiences for members when they need us. So it's very frustrating. Feature or infrastructure? Kind of a difficult question. It can be very, very confusing at first, but it's actually, I think, a very simple answer. Completely depends on whether the value creation from your perspective is direct or indirect. So if I'm personally writing a secrets management system to secure my software, I'm doing infrastructure because my business is never going to sell that stuff. But if I'm a HashiCorp employee writing features for Vault, I'm doing feature development. Totally depends on where the value is being generated for your particular outcome. Are you selling hammers or houses? That makes it a little bit clearer. All right, operations. Operations are really, really interesting to think about because all throughout and in every phase of the software development lifecycle, you see like time kind of bleeding out in operations. For requirements analysis, you're going to have a very different spend than on design and implementation, testing, like all this stuff. And that's just in steady state. And then there's also, like, it doesn't matter how great your code is, it can still break. There's still networks and stuff like that. And like cloud service systems where regions go down. There's a really good talk about this from a colleague of mine who I'm happy to plug, Ian Schenk, in GopherCon this year. So I encourage to look that up. He talks about some really good practices. And then there's technical debt, which is a really, really fun topic to talk about because we actually don't know what we're talking about when we talk about technical debt. So starting with the great George Box quote, these models are always wrong. But then getting beyond that, there's what do we mean by technical debt? I mean, implied in the name, there's that debt metaphor, which is you're just paying compound interest over time. How much does it compound? Is it like what, quarterly? I don't know. And what does that actually mean? How do you pay it? And can you really get your velocity back up from paying it? Yeah, probably. But then there's also the unhedged call option metaphor, which some of you might have seen, which is also a thing that happens, which we classify as tech debt, where you're just racing forward, not paying, feeling good about yourself, and then all of a sudden the world changes, your assumptions were wrong, and you're dead because you cannot adapt your software in time now to get it back on the market. So it's a phrase that we use, right, to describe a very real phenomenon that has real world consequences, but we don't know what we're talking about really. So we have to be really careful when we're making justifications in terms of technical debt investment. If people ask us to explain ourselves, we should probably have an answer. So another thing that's very useful. It's this is helpful to understand your neighbors. I was actually really surprised when I was first talking with Sarah on the product team. She, as a product manager, product managers feel the brunt of this. They protect us from a lot of this stuff, where client management, and they have to go to their clients and be like, well, the engineers need to go build infrastructure for like the next quarter, so you're not going to get anything out of them. And people say, why? And so she was kind of forcing me to be very pragmatic about it. It's like, everybody knows this stuff. But then systematized it, and then all of a sudden I saw other people come in and be like, everybody knows this stuff. But then I saw them kind of using the vocabulary and changing the way they were reasoning about things. Like, okay, maybe it's useful. I don't know. And so anyway, understanding your neighbors, it facilitates communication. And I would say the situational awareness piece is really, really important if you're collaborating with people. It's really useful to understand what their current objectives are, where their pain points are, like how they spend their time. It just really, really greases the wheels in my experience. And having common vocabulary just makes it super easy to talk about. And then there's the intentional team design. If you're relying on an operations team or an infrastructure development team, it's really important for everybody to understand like how that is creating a system that creates the most value, and like getting back to the objective function, how that multi-team strategy for compartmentalizing the efforts of dimensions is being leveraged to the point that the maximum point that you can leverage it. It's also just really good to understand that your ops people are doing you a solid, just in general. Sometimes they're underappreciated. And so here's a few hypotheses. I mean, it's really kind of fun because you can play around with this stuff and like just think about like, okay, so what are some other implications of all this stuff, and really start to get more systematic about the claims that we're making about the work that we're doing. So we can say, I think fairly convincingly, we can talk to other business stakeholders to say, if we want to optimize value creation, like, I'm sorry, but it definitely requires that we do activities that are not directly related to value creation. And here's why. And talking in terms of infrastructure and tech debt and operations, I found that to be something that really makes sense to a lot of people and resonates with some people. It becomes an easier argument. Certainty in feature development reduces tech debt creation. If we're going to say that tech debt accrues when there's incomplete information, it just kind of follows. Uncertainty, it's one of my favorite ones I was thinking of. Uncertainty in infrastructure development really accelerates tech debt creation. I mean, thinking about tech debt in features is one thing. Thinking about tech debt in the infrastructure that you're launching, like maybe there's incorrect assumptions, you're not quite solving for the right problem, you're not abstracting in the right way. You add a lot of tech debt to that, multiply it throughout your organization, and it really can snowball. It sucks a lot of value out of a lot of people. And so we can say infrastructure investment multiplies value creation over time, somewhere between 0 and infinity. I don't know where it stops. But the very interesting thing is it definitely can be less than 1. And that's just a failed project. But we should be receptive to thinking about that. If we make infrastructure, if we decide to lead our team down the path or really argue for an infrastructure project that ends up not really accelerating value creation somewhere, it is a failed project. It was a waste of time. Infrastructure choices, I would say, can be compared by their effect on operational spend. That's a pretty interesting one to keep in mind. Design approaches can be compared by their effect on operational spend. So if we're going to talk about mini services versus microservices versus whatever, I would say these things should be comparable. Unchecked technical debt, of course, is going to cause you all to stall. And others, you're limited only by your creativity. So in conclusion, I would consider it a success if people came away feeling like you know less about software development than when you came in. That would be really great, because none of us really know that much about it. And be prepared to justify your efforts in terms of the business value, whether you're doing infrastructure, tech debt. Like, these things should be very, very targeted, very well rationalized, and we should be accountable to the outcomes. And also, the burden is really on us to communicate very systematically with our stakeholders, because we can't expect our stakeholders to understand us when we don't even necessarily understand our own work. So that's it. Okay, questions? Yes. So like to get more certainty in the development cycle, try to answer the questions as late as possible is usually the best answer. I think that's the whole agile thing. Like, have at it with as little understanding as you can get away with, so that you can learn and not actually have time wasted when you get to those decision points. It sounds, if I was just to go completely off the cuff, and I'm probably entirely wrong, but it sounds like some of these projects might be overspecified a little bit too early. That might not be helpful. I think maybe overspecified. If you're ending up when there's I'm not sure I can answer your question without more details, but not specified enough. It's hard to tell. I'm getting into the weeds here, but sometimes I find it very hard to tell, because sometimes when we've gotten to a point where there's we're at a decision point and there's confusion, it's maybe because we overshot the mark, and we should have actually answered the question a little bit sooner. Shorter iteration cycles, I think, would be the agile way of dealing with that. Like, looking too far out, and maybe shorten the cycle to a week if it's 2 weeks, or 3 days if it's a week. So I don't know if that's helpful. I suspect not, but it's my answer. All right.
Do you recommend any resources
Oh, all the time. Yeah. No, I mean, it's like who has until they've worked in this kind of environment. I mean, typically it's you have people coming out of school, they like get onboarded into this process, and depending on where they are onboarded, they might have picked up some habits which don't lend themselves very well to justifying their actions on a very detailed level. So I tend to find it can be really frustrating to deal with people who get very, very defensive about that. As soon as you start asking questions and challenging, that's like, it's a very common reaction. But if you persist, it can become just part of the social fabric. I mean, I know at Google it was lovely because when you submitted your first diffs, I mean, it was just you just got piled on and kicked, and so like any ego just got stamped out. I mean, if it was possible, the ego got stamped out pretty early. And I think that's a good way of doing it.
I find sometimes it's hard to convince stakeholders to invest time on tech debt until the problem becomes exceedingly obvious that it's impeding future development.
Yeah.
Is there any recommendation as to like how to, I guess, try to get that tech debt time earlier on so that we prevent that like sudden hitting on the wall and saying like we cannot do any future development until we invest on.
Yeah. I mean, it's a hard problem, and I'm not sure that there's a real answer there, except one of the things is just trying to speak as systematically as possible to get. And maybe if you find somebody that they trust, to say, yeah, that's right. Let them do that. Invest in tech debt. Maybe you can bootstrap the process that way. But I find that without that, you have to have examples of failures, and you have to then convince them that your explanation for the failure is a legitimate one, and so it doesn't happen again. That sucks because that means that you have to get into a crappy situation. But if you can't bootstrap it with just your own credibility with that person, or getting somebody who has credibility with that person, then I don't know what else to do. I mean, you can sandbag, but I think that's a bad answer because I like transparency.
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
So sometimes it helps, especially if you're working in an agile environment, and if you have a Scrum Master. Oftentimes business people, they're more leaning towards listening from a Scrum Master or somebody else than from the developers, telling them, hey, I know we want to get this out as soon as possible, but we're going to use this later in those features and some other features. So it's better we spend the time now and than to rework it again later, so it won't become a technical debt later in the stages of development. So this happened actually in one of the projects that I worked on, and it was really hard for us to get the business owners to agree for, there were certain features that we're working on, and they just want to get it out for the week as priority, but we know that it's going to come back again later, and we'll have to work on it completely from the scratch. So
Yeah.
sometimes it's hard to avoid technical debt, but what helps developers is if you can give a big picture of the entire project. And it's really, I feel like it is really important in the agile environment because you don't have the complete scope of the project. You only have certain features on hand. You prioritize them, you work on them, and at the end of 2 weeks or end of your sprint, you're done with it. And the next sprint comes on, and sometimes whatever the work you did in this sprint may become unusable or may not be needed anymore. So
Yeah. Well, that can be nice. I mean, that's like part of the technical debt metaphor is like maybe you can declare bankruptcy on that bad code and just never see it again. It's kind of cool.
I'm curious if there are tools that actually measure the reduction in feature development velocity, because you have this graph that has.
I made it up. Yeah, I made it up. All right. It's
how long it takes for a sprint. I mean, how many sprints does it take to get a feature out? If we started maybe tracking those metrics, would that be some numbers that then you can take to
Yeah, but then how do you compare? I mean, we do points and things like that, but even points I find to be very non-comparable between teams and even between people sometimes. So yeah, it's we started those discussions, I don't know, a while back. It's like, well, you know, this is a 5-point thing, but it's actually a 1-point thing for this other person. I was like, wow, what are we doing? And so if you know how to do it better, I would love you to tell me, because really the only thing that I come back to over and over is very, very subjective. It's just, you know, how does it feel? Does it feel quick? Does it feel good? People feel like they're not stuck. And if they feel that way, it's probably good, but we don't have empirical data to suggest that, which makes a lot of these hypotheses kind of hard to test.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, because usually you kind of know as an engineering team that you are, I mean, you know it, you kind of feel it, but it's hard that we have no quantifiable way of measuring it.
Yes.
To make the case. But I guess as engineers, you kind of know.
Yeah, I just can't shake that, like just kind of knowing in my bones that this is a real thing. And you know, we just don't quite maybe have the right lens to look at it, but we can feel it and assess it. You look like you're kicking me off the stage. That's all right. Okay. Thank you.
Isaac, thank you so much.